Okay, students, I'd like to introduce you to ceramic making and some of the terms that we'll be using in class while we make our ceramics. The first thing we're going to do is just define what clay is. Clay is fine particles or fine sediment that can be filtered from the earth, but the molecules stick together and so they clump together, and when we heat them up they actually harden a lot like cement might, or they could crystallize in a way that will harden the ceramics. When you get clay in a refined form, it's wet already. If it seems dry to you, you can add water. But we need to do what's called wedging. And so wedging is when we kind of work the clay molecules so that they're all going one direction, but we also can add water, add or subtract water, and we want to smash the clay basically so that we get rid of air bubbles. We don't want air bubbles in clay because they tend to expand when they heat up, when we fire or we heat the clay, and it can ruin your projects. It can crack them. It can explode in the kiln. But there are different kinds of stages that happen to the clay. So when you let the clay dry, it becomes greenware. Okay, so if we let it dry and there's air bubbles in it, there's no way of telling, right? So greenware is dry clay. And greenware is that stage, it needs to be dry before it goes into the kiln. So what is a kiln? A kiln is where we fire, so I'm just going to put this in quotes, we fire our clay. We call it firing because this process is ancient, as ancient as can be. We're talking 800 BC, so this has been going on for 8,000 BC. It's been going on for 10,000 years that people have been firing, but that's what they started with, was firing. Mr. Kimball has an electric kiln. There are also gas kilns now, but they're surrounded by brick that insulate it, and they get really hot. They can get up to 2,000 or more degrees inside of that kiln. Now, after we pull clay out of a kiln, we call that bisqueware. Now, bisqueware is a lot different makeup of materials than the greenware. The clay has kind of crystallized and hardened. It's harder. It can still break, but then there's less color involved. So you'll notice your clay was a lot darker before you put it in the kiln. A lot of my clay turns pink when it comes out, and it's no longer a dark gray. Now the next idea is that you actually have to go back to the kiln, but before you go back to the kiln, you want to add some color to this bisqueware. So we're going to use a silica based. Silica is like sand, and we're going to glaze it. So we have different colored glazes, and when we glaze things, we paint this silica, this colored silica, onto your bisqueware, and then we fire it again before firing. Okay, so you understand what glaze is, but we'll demonstrate it in class as well. So you have to fire that glaze again on the silica or on the bisqueware before you can get it out, and then you can take it. So this process goes, you got to be patient with it. Some other things that I want to teach you about what we need to do to clay are things like scratch. If you wanted to add clay, 2 pieces of clay, you need to scratch and slip the clay. So here is a pot that I make out of clay, and I want to put a handle. Here's my handle. I want to put it onto this side of this. Well, I need to literally scratch into my wet clay where the handles are going to be added on. We're going to just scratch some marks into the clay on both pieces, and then we're going to add slip. So we know what scratching is, but slip is liquefied clay. So it's like cement. So it's like cement or mortar. And we just put a little bit of that in each piece, on each piece, and just slime it. And then we press those together and smooth them out. And that acts as a cement. But you can't just put 2 pieces of clay together and expect them to stay, because once they dry, they just fall apart. And you can try that if you want to prove that it works that way, but we don't waste clay if we learn this lesson early, that scratching and slipping keeps them together like cement. Okay, so I'd like to now teach you about several kinds of objects that we're going to make. So one is a coil. So when you roll out clay like a snake, like a long cylindrical piece of, like you've done it with Play-Doh, you roll it out like this, like the pen, and the thinner it is, the more fragile it is. But you want to use coils to make a coil pot. So one of the things we're going to make is a coil pot. And so we're going to build up clay like this, and we're going to scratch and slip it together as we build it up. So this thing will have a base, and then you'll start coiling the pot up. We will also make a pinch pot. And a pinch pot is the most basic and earliest kinds of pots that were made. It is literally just taking a ball of clay, sticking your thumb down in the middle of it, and then rotating it in your hand until you've come up with a pot. So I'll show you this in a separate video, but a pinch pot is like the beginning. Before they came up with a potter's wheel, you rotated it in your hand instead of on a potter's wheel. Now, the next one is slab. A slab building. So you're not making a building, but you're using slabs. You roll out clay with a rolling pin. Roll out flat. So you're going to have a piece of clay that's nice and flat. You roll it out, but it shouldn't be it should be a certain thickness. So I'm going to talk about this thickness, and my kind of rule for you is that we don't want the clay to be, so let's talk about thickness. We don't want it to be any thicker than our thumb. And this is not always true, but just generally true. We want it thumb thick, or if you're going to go thinner than that, we don't want it any thinner than our pinky thin. So thumb thick or pinky thin. And that way we stay away from cracking, we stay away from issues of, there's less likely to be air bubbles in it if you've rolled it out. And so I have rolling pins, I have tools in my class. Now you can carve things into this, and you can stamp things into your clay, and so you'll be required to use some patterns in your clay as well when you carve or stamp things into the clay. You can just about use anything you want, anything you can find. I have forks, plastic forks you can make things with. You can have little needle carving tools, clay working tools that you can do it with. But these are generally the ideas of ceramics that we're going to begin with. Now I'll demonstrate some of these things in the videos, but you need to know the vocabulary for the end of the term.